Well, it doesn't get more specific than this. How to hire your own podcast producer. I have not only been a podcast producer going on 8 years, but I transitioned from podcast producer to podcast agency owner. I've hired over 100 editors. I've worked with over 20 podcast producers. I've worked in multiple music and podcast studios. I know a little bit about everything in this industry. So if you're clicking on this and you don't know who I am, I'm Ryan Sullivan. This is what we do at Podcast Principles, is we simplify all this stuff for you. And that's why this content is completely free. Now, the goal here for you on the other end is to know if this is right for you, number one. It's to determine budget, because that's probably your next question. And number three, it's to have some kind of framework on how to do this. So the first thing we're going to talk about is cost. The next is the deliverables, meaning what they actually do for you and send you. And then finally, we're going to talk about how to actually put out a job post, whether that's paid or free, so you can hire one. So let's jump into it. Cost. We did go through this in our episode on virtual assistant versus podcast producer. So if you want a deeper breakdown or want to know what a virtual assistant gets paid, then you can go ahead and watch that episode. But today we're talking about the podcast producer. I do not know a world where you're spending less than $1,000 a month on a good, solid podcast producer. Now, this doesn't mean US based or non-US based. Could be anybody almost anywhere. But what we're talking about here is experience and skill level. The reason why you're hiring a podcast producer is because they've worked on other podcasts before. They specialize in podcasting, not in being an assistant or managing. And they also want to contribute, maybe even beyond the scope of their edits, to give you some sort of creative direction or small creative ideas along the way, right? So you're hiring a podcast producer to have somebody that obviously manages the podcast, but may also be able to make some creative decisions too. So let's get back to costs. $1,000 a month is going to be your minimum for 4 episodes a month. Now that comes to $250 per episode. That's almost virtual assistant territory. I'll be honest with you, it's going to be difficult to find somebody at $250 per episode if there's audio, video, graphics, show notes, distribution, and even maybe booking some guests or even showing up to the sound check. That you're going to struggle to find that. The real magic is going to start to happen between $500 and $1,000 per episode. This is because this person can take the time that it takes to really make these assets shine and create something unique for you. The reason being that this is a difficult role is because everybody wants everything faster, oftentimes for no reason. And then that means that there's going to be corners cut. So think about this. If you want somebody to be running and gunning for you and essentially be an extended version of an assistant, hire a virtual assistant to do this. If you want somebody who's a podcast specialist that may even help you grow or come up with ideas, but also manage the podcast, you're going to spend a little bit more money into the $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, up to $5,000 a month range. But you're going to have somebody dedicated to this who's going to be able to work with you. And also the big piece here is trust, right? This is somebody you're going to trust with giving access to your socials, or your access to your YouTube channel, or access to the back end of your podcast, or invite to your Slack, right? So that's why you're always going to pay more money for more trust. But that's the cost side of things. Those are some roundabout numbers that we can work with. Next up here is deliverables. What can I expect a podcast producer to do for me? Great question, right? So what I expect a podcast producer to do, at least in 2025 or 2030, or in this market of modern day podcasting, is basically everything. I want them to be able to write the show notes, do the audio edit, do the full form video edit, upload and distribute that podcast, and the big one here, make clips. Any great podcast producer is going to, if they're not already, become an expert in not just editing your clips, but also selecting your clips. And this is where a podcast producer comes in. And this is the big difference between a podcast producer and a virtual assistant. A virtual assistant doesn't have that eye. They don't have that branding awareness or content awareness, but a podcast producer does. They should be able to go through an episode, sift through the episode for you, and choose those best moments, essentially without you being involved at all. But back to the original point, the modern day podcast producer, you're gonna want them to have that full spread, right? Obviously, like anybody, they're going to be way better at one thing versus another. Maybe they have 3 to 4 years in video, but only 1 year in graphic design. Or they're a really strong video editor, but not as strong of a writer. So that comes with the territory. If you want somebody who hits every single mark on every single asset in every single skill set, then obviously that's possible, but you're going to pay more money for it. So when it comes to deliverables, the bar is pretty high here. I mean, I expect if I'm paying thousands a month for that podcast producer to run this entire podcast, realistically, I really want to just click record and then ship it off. So that's going to be the deliverable side of the podcast producer equation. All right, number 3, the big one beyond cost, beyond deliverables, is how do I find somebody to edit my podcast? This is a great question because there's no right answer. If you think about how you got a job, right? Think about how, if you have a family, how your kids got their summer job, or how you mobilized and elevated in your career to maybe become a CEO or a founder. You obviously worked at jobs, and I bet you got jobs in all different ways. So the best way to find a podcast producer is the best way to find any job. It's to know somebody, right? So by you putting out your podcast, you probably have producers, or at the very least editors, in your DMs asking you if you need help. Most of the editors that work for us have actually came to us. They actually DM'd me saying, hey, I edit videos, or hey, I produce podcasts. Can I do a sample for you? That's going to be the best way to find somebody. At least that's my preferred way. Because then, listen, I don't have to go out and take the time. I don't have to make the job post. They come to me. So make sure you're using and leveraging your network. A cheat code here: ask every single person you know who has a podcast what they do for their production. And if they do have a producer, most producers don't work for just one show. They may be working on 5 or 10 shows. So maybe they can absorb your podcast too. The last piece of this is the job post. This is the thing that, you know, listen, it's brutal, right? Hiring, recruiting, all that. You're not a staffing firm. You're a podcaster or a business owner who has a podcast, right? You don't want to be spending tens of thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours finding that perfect podcast producer. Now you can make a job post on something like Upwork, right? Or find somebody on a platform like Fiverr. Now, there are caveats to this. If I'm making a job post for a podcast producer, the things that I want to know are budget off the bat, right? Meaning put some kind of general budget that you have. That's going to self-select a lot of folks. Then we're going to have the working time zone. This is not the time zone they live on. This is the time zone they work on. That's really important. Then we want to have appetite, meaning what is their preferred style or their preferred method, right? And so you want to have that on your posts. You want to say, our number one most important thing here is the video, or the number one most important thing here is the clips, right? So when it comes to your podcast producer role, most companies are going to try to make everything seem even, meaning you have to graphic design, show note, distribute, blah, blah, blah. But if you put an emphasis on the thing that you really care about, that's going to help as well. Now, here's the big one, the big one that we covered in the last episode, co-hosted episode as well, which is sampling. Sample. I can't say it enough. I sample probably one video editor almost per day. Probably 3 to 4 video editors a month I'm sampling. And what I mean by that is I'm paying them to make me a video, right? To edit a video. The sample doesn't matter. You're paying to experience how they work and how they communicate. Because the podcast producer's job is 50% podcast producing and 50% communication, right? I mean, it's basically most jobs. And so now, does perfect communication fix terrible editing? Not at all. But there are folks who will sell you the dream and then they won't answer you for 4 or 5 days, right? And obviously that's not what we want. So what you want to do is you want to either have a free or a paid sample, and you want to have an expert judge those samples. So it would be way better. You'll be way better off if you pay somebody like a podcast producer or a podcast agency, somebody who knows a lot about this, to vet those samples, because they're going to see things, hear things that you just don't see and hear with these samples. And they're going to be able to at least X out probably 50% of the candidates just because you hired an expert. It's the same thing as hiring a mechanic to help you buy a car. They already know the signs. They might see 1 or 2 things and go, hey, this isn't the one for you. So we didn't have to waste all of our time on that. So that's where bringing an expert into this equation is going to make a lot of sense. All right, let's wrap this whole thing up. We're hiring a podcast producer or not. You might want to hire a virtual assistant. And in that case, if you want to explore that, you can go ahead and watch that episode. That's going to be virtual assistant versus podcast producer. Maybe this sounds extremely intimidating and like it sucks. And if that's the case, then you might want to do agency versus in-house, right? Which is another one of our episodes where I break down, should you hire an in-house person and train them or hire a podcast agency or marketing agency to do this for you? No matter what you decide, just make sure it's right for your budget. It's a right cultural fit for your company. The time zone works, the communication's there, and then just know this is at will. This is 1099 labor we're talking about here. So you're not locked in to some insane contract. You're not holding your podcast hostage. You do have options here. You do have time to work. Ultimately, that is what you need to make this process easy and effortless for you, is time. Just give yourself time, and trust me, it'll be fine. So, wishing you the best of luck on your journey when it comes to hiring your podcast producer. My name is Ryan from Podcast Principles. This is exactly what we do. If you're here on YouTube for the first time or even returning viewer, just make sure that subscribe button is clicked so I can get my dopamine hit for the day and you can get some help hiring your podcast producer. So, catch you. Appreciate it. Ryan Sullivan, Podcast Principles. I'll catch everybody on the next one.